In the hidden chambers of medieval laboratories, where flickering candles cast dancing shadows across walls lined with cryptic manuscripts and glass vessels, the alchemists understood something that modern psychology would only rediscover centuries later: that transformation requires heat, not the gentle warmth of comfort nor the mild temperature of incremental change, but the searing intensity of fire applied with precision and purpose. They spoke in coded language of furnaces and flames, of carefully regulated temperatures that could transmute base metal into gold. Yet beneath this metallurgical facade lay something far more profound: a map of consciousness itself, a guide to the temperatures required to burn away falsehood and forge authenticity. The alchemical tradition preserved within its symbolic vocabulary a remarkable secret: that human consciousness requires specific intensities of psychological heat to undergo genuine transformation. Just as the medieval adept knew that different operations demanded different degrees of fire, so too did they recognize that the soul's refinement proceeds through distinct temperatures of experience. This was never mere metaphor. The heat they described corresponds to actual intensities of psychological pressure, specific degrees of confrontation with reality that catalyze different orders of change. What appears in their texts as instruction for managing physical flames reveals itself to those with eyes to see as a precise phenomenology of transformative suffering. Carl Jung, inheriting this wisdom through his deep immersion in alchemical literature, recognized in these temperature gradations a sophisticated understanding of individuation's demands. The heat that transforms consciousness, he understood, comes not from external circumstance alone, but from the friction generated when unconscious contents press against the barriers of ego consciousness. Each temperature represents a different intensity of this confrontation, a specific degree of pressure that the psyche must withstand to undergo its particular metamorphosis. The alchemists encoded this knowledge in their descriptions of three fundamental fires: the gentle heat that awakens, the moderate flame that purifies, and the intense conflagration that dissolves and reconstitutes. The first temperature operates at the threshold of awareness itself. The alchemists called this the bath of Mary, the balneum Mariae, a gentle heat applied indirectly through water. In psychological terms, this represents the initial warmth of consciousness beginning to penetrate the unconscious. It is the temperature at which dreams intensify, when synchronicities multiply, when the ordinary world begins to shimmer with symbolic significance. This heat does not force or break, it softens, it permeates, it gradually brings to awareness what has lain dormant. The individual experiencing this temperature finds their assumptions quietly questioned, their certainties gently undermined. Old wounds begin to ache with new meaning. Forgotten memories surface unbidden. The familiar landscape of identity reveals unexpected contours. This first heat requires patience above all else. It operates through sustained attention rather than dramatic intervention. The individual must learn to maintain consciousness in the face of discomfort without immediately acting to relieve it. This is the temperature at which the raw material of the psyche begins its softening, where rigid structures of identity become malleable enough to work with. Yet many flee even this gentle heat, finding intolerable the mild anxiety of emerging self-awareness. They prefer the cool darkness of unconsciousness to the warm light of attention. They return to distraction, to habit, to the comfortable grooves of mechanical living. The alchemists knew this tendency and warned repeatedly. The work begins with patient application of subtle heat. Rush this stage, apply too much intensity too soon, and the material hardens rather than softens. The vessel shatters, the work is lost. Those who can sustain this first temperature long enough discover something remarkable. Consciousness begins to penetrate into regions previously dark and unknown. Shadow material rises to the surface. not yet in its full terrifying intensity, but in manageable portions. Dreams become more vivid and more demanding of attention. The individual notices patterns they had not seen before, recognizes compulsions and reactions that operate automatically. This temperature brings the gift of beginnings, the first stirrings of genuine self-knowledge. It is the heat that melts ice, that brings spring after winter, that initiates growth. Without it, no further transformation can occur. The second temperature burns significantly hotter. The alchemists called this the heat of sand or ashes, a moderate but sustained fire that could be maintained for hours or days. Psychologically, this represents the sustained pressure of conscious engagement with shadow material. No longer gentle intimations, but direct encounters with what has been repressed, denied, projected. This is the temperature at which the individual must face their capacity for cruelty, their participation in patterns they have judged in others, their complicity in their own suffering. The heat comes from maintaining awareness in the presence of material the ego desperately wishes to reject or flee from. At this temperature, psychological structures begin to decompose in earnest. The individual experiences what the alchemists called putrefaction, the necessary rotting away of false identities and defensive strategies. This is profoundly uncomfortable. The comforting narratives that have sustained self-image reveal themselves as protective fictions. Cherished beliefs about oneself prove unfounded under scrutiny. Relationships that seemed loving expose their shadow of mutual exploitation. Achievements that brought pride reveal their roots in fear or compensation. The individual maintained at this temperature long enough undergoes a systematic dismantling of ego structures, not through philosophical argument, but through the felt experience of their inadequacy. This second heat demands a quality the alchemists called patience in the work, what Jung described as the capacity to hold the tension of opposites without premature resolution. The individual must neither flee the intensity nor identify completely with the darkness being revealed. To flee is to abandon the work, to return to the cool darkness of unconsciousness. But to identify utterly with the shadow material is equally destructive. The ego drowns in guilt, self-hatred, or nihilistic despair. The art consists in maintaining consciousness at precisely the temperature where transformation can occur, hot enough to dissolve rigidity, but not so hot that the container itself disintegrates. Most who reach this temperature find themselves in crisis. Relationships that reinforced false self-image become intolerable. Work that provided ego gratification loses its appeal. Pursuits that offered distraction fail to engage. The individual may appear to others as having lost their way, become depressed, fallen into self-absorption. Yet if the heat can be maintained, if consciousness can hold firm in the presence of psychological pressure, something remarkable begins to occur. The opposites that seemed incompatible begin to speak to one another. The persona and the shadow, previously kept in rigid separation, start to interpenetrate. What emerges is not a bland compromise, but a more complex, more truthful self-image that can acknowledge multiplicity without fragmenting. This second temperature represents perhaps the most prolonged phase of alchemical work. It cannot be rushed. The alchemist monitoring their furnace knew that insufficient heat leaves the work incomplete, while excessive heat burns the material to ash. So too the individual. Too little psychological pressure allows defensive structures to remain intact, while too much shatters the ego's capacity to contain the process. This is where many abandon the work, finding the sustained discomfort intolerable. They seek premature resolution through new identifications, spiritual bypassing, or return to unconsciousness. The alchemists understood this temptation and encoded countless warnings in their texts. Maintain the fire, tend the vessel, trust the process even when nothing seems to happen for weeks or months on end. The third temperature burns with an intensity that few can withstand. The alchemists called this the fire of calcination, the heat that reduces substance to ash, the flame that destroys to make possible radical reconstitution. Psychologically, this represents what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, what Jung described as the confrontation with the self. This is no longer merely the integration of personal shadow material, but the dissolution of ego consciousness itself in the presence of the transpersonal. At this temperature, the individual experiences the complete inadequacy of their constructed identity, not as philosophical concept but as lived catastrophe. This heat arrives often unbidden, frequently through crisis that shatters carefully maintained order. The death of someone central to one's identity, the collapse of a life structure that provided meaning, an illness that strips away the illusion of control, an awakening that reveals the profound suffering underlying existence. Sometimes it comes through spiritual practice that has opened doors the practitioner is not prepared to enter. Other times, through psychedelic experience that temporarily removes the filters through which consciousness normally operates. However it arrives, this temperature brings the individual face to face with the absolute dissolution of ego as the center of existence. At this temperature, the philosophical becomes immediate and undeniable. The impermanence that was an abstract concept reveals itself as the felt disintegration of everything one took as solid. The interconnection that seemed a pleasant spiritual idea manifests as the dissolving of boundaries between self and world. The void that was a theological proposition opens as an immediate absence at the core of being. The individual experiences what the Buddhists call sunyata, what the Christian mystics call divine darkness, what the alchemists encoded as the nigredo, the blackening, the death, the reduction to prima materia. This is the temperature from which many do not return intact. The ego, confronted with its own constructed nature, may fragment rather than surrender. The individual may retreat into psychosis, unable to reconstitute a functional sense of self. They may construct a spiritual ego even more rigid than what was dissolved, armoring themselves in dogma or inflated identification with the transpersonal. Or they may return to ordinary consciousness, having touched something vast but unable to integrate it, haunted by an experience that remains incomprehensible and alienating. Yet for those who can surrender to this heat without fragmenting, who can die without literally dying, something unprecedented becomes possible. What emerges from this calcination is not the old ego reconstituted, but a new center of consciousness. The alchemists called this the birth of the philosophical child. Jung termed it the realization of the self. This is not enlightenment in the sense of permanent transcendence, but rather a fundamental shift in the locus of identity. The ego remains as a functional organizing principle, but it is no longer experienced as the totality of who one is. There is awareness of awareness itself, consciousness recognizing itself as both subject and object, container and contained. The individual who has undergone this third temperature returns to ordinary life profoundly changed, not perfected, not finished, but fundamentally reoriented. Suffering continues but is held differently, no longer as punishment or problem, but as the friction necessary for consciousness to recognize itself. The urgency around personal achievement diminishes, not into apathy, but into recognition of the relative nature of temporal goals. Death, rather than being denied or feared, is integrated as the horizon that gives life its significance. The individual becomes capable of what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to stand alone, to trust one's own experience, to bear the tension of not knowing. What sustains a person through these three temperatures? The alchemists spoke of the love of the work itself, what they called amor Dei, the love of God. Jung understood this as the numinous dimension of psyche, the sense that something greater than ego participates in the process. Those who complete the work do not do so through willpower alone, but through a mysterious capacity to serve something they cannot fully understand. They discover that consciousness itself demands its own evolution, that psyche contains a telos, a purpose or end, that operates through but transcends individual intention. The progression through these three temperatures need not be linear or final. Most who walk this path move through cycles, visiting and revisiting each intensity as different layers of the psyche reveal themselves. What was integrated at one temperature may require further refinement at another. The shadow confronted in the second heat may contain depths that only reveal themselves in the third. The dissolution experienced in the nigredo may need to be undergone multiple times as consciousness encounters new regions of its own vastness. Moreover, these temperatures do not guarantee any particular outcome beyond transformation itself. The gold the alchemists sought is not worldly success, pleasant emotion, or social validation. It is the irreducible authenticity of consciousness, knowing itself, the integration of what was split, the union of what was kept separate. The individual transformed by these fires may appear to others much as they did before. Their essential strangeness, if anything, deepens. They become less legible to conventional understanding, their motivations less obviously aligned with collective values. The loneliness of this path cannot be overstated. To undergo these temperatures is to become progressively more isolated from those who have not. Language fails to convey what has been experienced. Relationships formed before transformation may no longer fit the person who emerges. The individual finds themselves in the peculiar position of appearing normal while inhabiting a radically altered inner landscape. They must learn to live in two worlds simultaneously, the consensus reality of social exchange and the imaginal reality of symbolic depth. This double consciousness is both burden and gift, alienating and liberating in equal measure. Yet there is also unexpected companionship. Those who have undergone similar fires recognize one another, not through doctrine or description, but through a quality of presence. They share what the alchemists called the secret fire, the animating principle that continues the work beyond any individual's effort. They discover they are participants in something ancient and ongoing, a lineage of transformation that extends backward through countless individuals who chose consciousness over comfort, truth over security, authenticity over belonging. The ethical implications of undergoing these temperatures deserve attention. The individual transformed by alchemical heat cannot return to naive participation in collective values. They have seen too deeply into the constructed nature of social reality, the arbitrary character of cultural norms, the shadow underlying collective movements. This creates responsibility, the temptation to withdraw into spiritual superiority, to judge those who remain unconscious, to use insight as weapon. These must be recognized and resisted. The true gold of the work is not in knowing but in being, not in understanding others, but in becoming oneself so completely that one's very presence serves as invitation rather than judgment. The transformed individual discovers that their greatest contribution lies not in teaching, but in embodying. They become what Jung called a symbolic personality, someone whose very existence demonstrates possibility. They show through their being that consciousness can expand, that ego can die and reform, that meaning persists through dissolution. This is not a role one assumes, but a function one performs simply by living authentically, by refusing to flee the heat when it arises, by maintaining consciousness in the presence of pressure. There is also the question of deliberate cultivation versus grace. Can these temperatures be sought, or do they arrive unbidden? The alchemical tradition suggests both are true. The individual must prepare the vessel through sustained attention and ethical living, must learn basic practices of consciousness, must clear away gross obstacles to awareness. But the heat itself, the pressure that catalyzes transformation, often arrives through circumstance the ego did not choose and cannot control. The art consists in recognizing these temperatures when they arise and consenting to them rather than fleeing. The individual cannot manufacture spiritual crisis, but can choose whether to run from it or enter it fully. Modern approaches to transformation frequently attempt to bypass this requirement of heat. They promise growth without discomfort, awakening without dissolution, gold without fire. Such approaches deliver at best minor adjustments to ego functioning. They rearrange furniture in the house of consciousness, but do not reconstruct its foundation. The alchemical tradition stands as corrective to this wishful thinking. It insists that transformation worthy of the name requires the sustained application of psychological heat, that consciousness expands only under pressure, that authenticity is forged through confrontation with what we most wish to avoid. This is not an argument for seeking suffering or valorizing crisis. The heat the alchemists described is not neurotic torment or self-inflicted hardship. It is the specific intensity that emerges when consciousness honestly encounters reality, when awareness refuses the comfort of illusion, when attention is sustained in the presence of what is rather than what we wish were so. Some people's lives generate this heat naturally through circumstance. Others must cultivate it through practice and intention. In either case, the quality that matters is not the source of heat, but the willingness to neither flee it nor be destroyed by it. The contemporary world, with its technologies of distraction and its cultural emphasis on comfort, makes sustaining these temperatures increasingly difficult. Every impulse toward authentic self-confrontation can be immediately relieved through entertainment, substances, or social media. Every moment of fertile emptiness can be filled. Every uncomfortable truth can be rationalized away or dissolved in streams of content designed to occupy consciousness without demanding its development. The alchemical path thus becomes more challenging, even as information about it becomes more available. Yet the requirement for transformation remains unchanged. Consciousness still requires heat to expand. Ego still demands dissolution to reveal self. Shadow still needs integration for wholeness to emerge. The ancient technologies encoded in alchemical symbolism still describe the actual phenomenology of authentic change. Whether one engages these temperatures through deliberate spiritual practice, through depth psychotherapy, through life crisis, or through some combination, the underlying necessity persists. Consciousness transforms only under pressure, only through sustained application of psychological heat. The three temperatures thus form a complete map of transformative possibility. The first heat awakens, bringing consciousness to previously dark regions. The second heat purifies, burning away false structures and integrating shadow. The third heat reconstitutes, dissolving ego to reveal self. Together, they describe not a linear progression, but a spiral, a cycle that repeats at ever deeper levels as consciousness continues its own exploration. Those who enter this process discover they have not chosen it so much as consented to what chooses them. The telos of consciousness itself, the drive toward greater integration and authenticity that operates through but transcends individual will. In the end, the alchemical wisdom offers neither comfort nor certainty, but something more valuable: a map of the territory ahead, a description of the temperatures consciousness must endure to know itself. It confirms what those who walk this path already sense: that transformation is possible but costly, that authenticity demands everything, that consciousness insists on its own evolution regardless of ego's preferences. The fires that transform are not pleasant, but they are necessary. They burn away falsehood to reveal truth, destroy illusion to uncover reality, dissolve ego to manifest self. The crucible that contains these fires is consciousness itself. The material refined is not external substance, but the totality of one's being. The gold that emerges is not metaphorical but actual, the irreducible authenticity of awareness knowing itself, whole because integrated, free because honest, alive because awake. This gold cannot be stolen, tarnished or lost. It is the philosopher's stone within, the pearl of great price, the treasure that was always already present, but required fire to reveal. Those who seek it outside will search forever. Those who kindle the fire within discover they are themselves the gold they sought.